The debate around one nation, one election in the parliament has been presented as a conversation about efficiency, governance, and national interest. The language deployed in parliament is managerial rather than democratic. Elections have been described as disruptions, and governance as something that needs to be protected from politics, and democracy as this cost intensive process that needs streamlining. There is this simple assumption that elections are interruptions to governance rather than constitutive of it. There is this repeated claim that India is always in election mode and that constant electoral churn produces policy paralysis, causes administrative distraction, and fiscal waste. So, synchronizing elections, as we are told, will allow governments to govern without distraction for a full 5 year term. But this argument rests on a very thin understanding on how Indian democracy actually functions. So, to understand what is at stake, we need to first be clear about what the parliament is really claiming and what it is leaving unexamined. Let's break down the main argument. First is the efficiency argument. The proponents have frequently pointed to the financial cost of election and that multiple elections across states, they argue, drain public resources, they burden the election commission of India, and they divert administrative machinery from development work. Now, this argument treats elections as this budgetary inconvenience, but this is simply a category error because elections are not a discretionary expense like infrastructure overruns or any administrative inefficiency. They are the core accountability mechanism of any representative democracy. So, the question is not whether elections cost money, but whether the democratic value that they do generate at the end justifies that very cost. I'm going to be using a bunch of academic work to explain how frequent elections in India have not led to voter fatigue or democratic disengagement. In fact, on the contrary, the early 1990s and the 2000s, they saw this broadening of electoral participation, particularly amongst historically marginalized groups, exactly during a period of frequent state and national elections. So, in other words, electoral frequency in India has been a democratic stimulus and not a drain. So, to frame elections purely as expenditure misunderstands their true function in sustaining legitimacy in the country or even broadening political participation and political learning. The next argument they make is that of governance. The parliament claims that frequent elections have kept governments in permanent campaign mode that leads to short-term populism and policy stagnation. The Model Code of Conduct has been cited as an obstacle to governance. Now, this argument assumes a very clean separation between governance and politics. But in a democracy, governance is always political. The idea that there exists any neutral technocratic period of governance that elections do end up disrupting is a fantasy to me. Yogendra Yadav and Suhas Palshikar, they directly challenge this technocratic view. They argue that Indian democracy has evolved such that state politics has now become the primary arena of political contestation, and that elections are no longer episodic interruptions, they are simply a part of this continuous democratic process through which citizens get a chance to negotiate power, policy, and representation. State elections, in particular, are these moments where governance is evaluated closest to living experience or lived experience, like health, food distribution, pollution, welfare delivery, policy delivery, public service delivery. So to reduce their frequency in the name of uninterrupted governance is also to reduce the frequency of accountability the executive makes to its citizens. And the irony here is very clear. The very mechanism that forces governments to remain responsive is now being blamed for making them inefficient. Another argument they make is that of stability. There is this recurring claim that one nation, one election will bring political stability by preventing any sort of midterm volatility in the electorates. And a synchronized cycle will produce predictability in policy and in administration. But I ask, this stability is for whom? Indian political stability has never meant the absence of contestation. It has meant the managed coexistence of multiple and often conflicting political rhythms across states. Federal stability has been maintained not just by uniformity but also by allowing states to respond to local crises, leadership failure, or any political realignments in each of these states in their own timelines. Pradeep Chibba's work comes in here. His analysis basically shows that voters are capable of distinguishing between state and central governments, and that dissatisfaction at one level does not automatically translate into punishment at another. So this layered accountability is only made possible when elections are temporarily separated. The layering collapses with synchronized elections because it forces political judgment into a single moment, and that reduces the state's capacity to absorb dissent incrementally, which has been the case for the longest. So what the parliament here actually calls stability is actually in effect reduced democratic responsiveness. The most ideologically loaded claim that we found was that simultaneous elections will then strengthen national unity by aligning political discourse around shared national priorities. This is where the proposal starts to show its cracks. Yogendra Yadav and Suhas Palshikar, they've explicitly warned against the idea that democratic cohesion requires any sort of uniform political expression. Indian strength has been its ability to be able to sustain multiple political communities within a single constitutional framework, and states have now developed distinct political cultures with their own party systems, and they issue priorities in their own way, in no way do they threaten national unity. By synchronizing elections, political discourse becomes inevitably nationalized. Media attention, campaign narratives, voter cognition will now shift towards central leadership, national symbols, and majoritarian themes. So, state specific issues like agrarian distress in one region, or linguistic politics in another region, or welfare implementation in a particular place is going to get now drowned out because of this national spectacle. And this is not cohesion in any way, this is simply an attempt to homogenize. The most striking thing in the parliamentary debate was the questions that were not even asked. There was little to no discussion of how one nation, one election would affect regional parties, or how it will skew competition in favor of nationally dominant parties, or how it will alter voter behavior and not just voter turnout. This reflects a debate structured around administrative convenience rather than democratic design, which I feel like the parliament should be prioritizing first. Because once we take Indian political behavior seriously, once we recognize the fact that state elections are not smaller versions of national elections, but they're qualitatively different democratic moments, the logic of a synchronized election would collapse immediately. Now, if the parliamentary case for one nation, one election rests solely on the belief that elections across levels of government are interchangeable, then Pradeep Chibba's work dismantles that belief. His central question is very simple. When Indians vote in a national election, what exactly are they responding to? Are they merely expressing satisfaction or anger with their state governments? Or are they capable of forming judgments of the union government independently? This question matters because if voters are unable to distinguish between levels of government, then synchronizing elections may simply compress all the redundant decisions that they have to make. But if voters do and can distinguish between state and national performance, then this synchronization collapses meaningful democratic choice. And the answer in the work is extremely clear and it's backed by empirics. And the answer is that Indian voters are far more discerning than the one nation, one election proponents would assume. A core one nation, one election proponent assumption, rarely stated but always implied, is that voters deliver a single undifferentiated political verdict. Now, this assumption allows supporters to argue that multiple elections are redundant repetitions of the same preference. Chibber uses post-poll survey data from the National Election Study, and he shows that a substantial proportion of Indian voters have explicitly reported considering different levels of government when they make their voting decisions. Roughly 4 out of 10 voters have said that the performance of the central government mattered to their vote choice, either alone or in combination with the state government performance. He also demonstrates that these perceptions translate into actual voting behavior. Voters who believed that the central government mattered were significantly more likely to vote for the incumbent National Alliance. But those who did not care about the central government were more likely to vote based on considerations of the state issues or their regional affiliations. So basically, the voters were sorting their political judgments by level. Synchronized election, once it comes into play, would flatten this sorting process for the voter. So he examines 4 categories of voters: those who were satisfied with both the state and the central government, those who were satisfied with the state but dissatisfied with the center, those dissatisfied with the state but satisfied with the center, and those dissatisfied with both. The paper shows that voters who approved of their state government but disapproved of the central government often voted against the ruling National Alliance even when the same party governed the state. And conversely, voters who were living under opposition ruled states frequently voted for the central incumbent if they approved of its performance. This shows us that state approval does not automatically translate into national support, and that national approval can override state dissatisfaction as well, because voters are now capable of decoupling their political responsibility. But this decoupling is only possible when elections are temporarily separated. When voters are asked to make distinct judgments at distinct times, they have an opportunity to be able to reward or punish governments independently. These judgments under a synchronized election process would collapse into a single electoral moment, and it would force voters to prioritize a single level of government, and it's almost inevitably going to be the national. It's also important to understand that not all voters engage the same way with national politics. His data shows awareness of concern for the central government being socially uneven as well. Wealthier, more educated, urban male voters are far more likely to consider national performance when they're voting, while poorer voters, marginalized groups, and women, they are more likely to focus on state and local level governance, where state capacity and welfare delivery directly shapes everyday life of the citizen. Environment created by synchronized elections would structurally advantage voters who are already better positioned to be able to engage with national discourse. State elections, on the other hand, they lower the cognitive and informational barrier to participation. They center tangible experiences like ration delivery, like electricity, roads, policing, local corruption matters. For many citizens, especially the poor, this is where democracy actually becomes legible to them. And synchronizing elections would risk silencing those voters whose political engagement is most rooted in state level accountability. The paper gives us this very crucial insight, is that Indian democracy functions only through staggered accountability. Governments are not judged all at once. They are judged layer by layer and over time. A voter who is dissatisfied with the state government does not have to wait for 5 years to be able to express disapproval, whereas a voter who is unhappy with the center can also do so without destabilizing state level governance in any way. And the safety valve would vanish with one nation, one elections proposal, because accountability will then become episodic rather than continuous. And political dissatisfaction would accumulate rather than being periodically released. And because voters are then asked to make a composite judgment even when their experiences are mixed at the state and at the center. So this will not produce clarity in any way, it will only create more distortion. And in such a condition, the voter will tend to rely on the most visible and emotionally salient cues, using heuristics like national leadership or an identity narrative through broad ideological frames. And this would structurally favor majoritarian politics. So one nation, one election is not merely a question of scheduling. It is also a question of how responsibility is assigned in a federal democracy. Indian voters have developed a sophisticated democratic habit. They are in a position to punish failure where it occurs and reward success where it delivers. But this habit has evolved alongside the decentralized process of political power given to the states. So voters are being asked to technically abandon this entire habit, because the one nation one election proposal demands that voters collapse all their differentiated experiences into a single verdict. Once that happens, state elections would no longer be an instrument of accountability. They will simply become a subsidiary ritual within a national spectacle. And this is not efficiency, this is simply loss of democratic values. So, if Chibal tells us about how voters behave across levels of state, Yogendra Yadav and Suhas Palshikar have written a paper that tells us why as well. They have a very structural and historical intervention which is backed completely by empirics, and I don't think we should ignore it when we are discussing one nation, one election. The core claim here is blunt, that Indian democracy has undergone this long term shift in which the state, not the nation, has now become the primary arena of political choice. And this is not a temporary phase, it is not an aberration caused because of coalition politics. It was a structural transformation of Indian democracy itself. So, for much of India's early post independence history, elections were, of course, dominated by national moods. Congress functioned as this pan Indian umbrella where voters would use elections to be able to show their approval or disapproval of national leadership. But that era has very clearly ended, because by the 1990s, India entered what you call a new electoral system where Lok Sabha elections were understood as aggregations of state level contests and not the expression of a single national political movement. It meant that voters increasingly interpret politics through state level concerns, and electoral states vary sharply across states because national elections no longer override these uniform political waves. The one nation, one election proponent would assume exactly the opposite, that a single electoral moment will be able to capture all national political will. And in doing so, it tries to resurrect this political logic that Indian democracy has long outgrown over 2 decades ago. Indian states are not merely administrative divisions, they are real and imagined political communities. States have now developed distinct political cultures of their own, with their own linguistic and social vocabularies of politics, with unique hierarchies and moral economies within the state itself. So basically, what I'm trying to get at is that a welfare promise in Tamil Nadu may be irrelevant in Rajasthan, while a law and order narrative that dominates in Uttar Pradesh may have little to no meaning in Kerala. This is because these differences are simply democracy expressing itself at their appropriate scale in their appropriate regions. And state elections give institutional space to these political communities, while a synchronized election would compress them. When elections are synchronized, political discourse would inevitably shift upward. It'll go towards national leaders, national slogans, national media narratives, where state specific political cultures would rather be erased. No, not even erased, they would be overwritten. The danger here is very subtle because democracy will become less about lived experience of the citizen and more about symbolic alignment with the greater idea of the country. One flaw that I find in the imagination of a one nation, one election is the assumption of a coherent national party system. India does not have one party system. It has bipolar systems in some states, it has multipolar systems in some states, it has alliance driven systems elsewhere. There are states where regional parties dominate entirely. And these systems are not anomalies, they are adaptations to the social diversity, caste composition, and historical movements of those regions. One nation, one election would force these distinct systems into a single rhythm of electorates, and the result would become extremely predictable that national parties will then gain disproportionate advantage because of their access to resource, because of their scale, media access, while regional parties, smaller parties, would start to lose visibility and their space in narratives. Because electoral competition would converge around national issues even when state issues are decisive for governance at the grassroots. Regional parties are not distortions of Indian democracy. They are federal stabilizers. They translate local demands into national bargaining power by preventing the center from becoming politically insulated from state reality. Staggered elections would give regional parties temporal leverage. Their electoral cycles would allow them to negotiate, pressure, and influence national coalitions continuously. That leverage goes away with synchronized elections because regional parties would then be forced to compete in nationalized campaigns with their state specific bargaining power weakening, because federal politics would shift from negotiation into an absorption into the greater whole. And this is not efficiency of the federal system, it is erosion of a federal value. The paper also notes that voter turnout and political engagement are often higher in state elections than in national ones. Proponents of one nation, one election would argue otherwise. But I say I believe in this claim because state politics feels closer and more intelligible and more actionable to citizens on ground. One nation, one election assumes electoral fatigue of the citizen, but the Indian democracy and the system that it has set up is simply conditioning the citizen to political familiarity. Reducing the frequency of elections would not necessarily make our democracy healthier in any way because it risks making democracy more distant, especially for citizens whose political engagement is rooted in state level issues. In fact, with temporal spaces between elections, us as citizens sitting in a different part of the country can even note and observe state politics of another region, understanding the problems that that particular state faces with their own narratives and their own priorities. which would all be diluted with citizens focusing only within their own state and their immediate gains and benefits. This would also kill a lot of political discussions that people are able to have with each other, given the fact that one would be overloaded with informations from all sides. States differ widely in governance quality, institutional strength, and elite capture. Uniform electoral timing is not going to produce uniform governance outcomes. And without addressing the underlying diversity that shapes governance performance, you are creating this illusion of coherence, but you are leaving structural inequalities intact in the process as well. And that's the opportunity cost you are willing to sacrifice for the proponent. When I put together the analysis, the picture becomes extremely clear that one nation, one election tries to renationalize political imagination while weakening state level political communities, because you're advantaging nationally dominant parties while reducing continuous accountability from state level, flattening diverse party systems into this singular contest, which would not be an administrative reform, but this is simply a rescaling of democracy. And that rescaling or descaling, that we can call it, is going to simply move power upward. So far, we have established two things. One is that voters behave differently in state and national elections, and two, that Indian democracy structurally depends on state autonomy and staggered political time. But there is one more dimension that the parliament has ignored, and that is participation beyond voting, which asks the questions of who gets mobilized, who speaks, and who becomes politically visible at the end of the day. So, up to now, I've been focusing on voter behavior and political structure, but there is another democratic cost that rarely enters or has entered parliamentary debate till now, which is what happens to participation when elections become rarer, larger, and more nationalized. So, to answer this, we can move beyond turnout figures and into the terrain that was mapped by Palshekar and Sanjay Kumar. The terrain of how citizens participate, who participates, and what kinds of participation are even enabled by India's electoral rhythms. The findings are rather insightful. So, a core one nation, one election justification, like I mentioned before, was that India suffers from this election fatigue, that frequent elections exhaust the voters and it weakens the governance. But data shows the opposite. Palchikar and Kumar basically studied participation trends from the mid 1990s to the early 2000s, and they found out that frequent elections coincided with rising voter turnout and rising political interest, particularly amongst groups from historically excluded political life. And this period, often categorized as India's second democratic upsurge, and this era was marked by increased participation from lower castes. It had narrowed gender gaps in voter turnout. It had greater rural political mobilization, stronger identification with elections as meaningful political moments in their lives. And if electoral fatigue was real, then this shouldn't have happened. Participation in a democracy is more than voting, and elections enable it. So, the most important part of that research paper was their insistence of the authors that democracy cannot be measured by turnout alone. There's multiple dimensions of political participation that you can take into account, which could be things like interest in election campaigns, attendance at rallies, campaign work, party membership, political discussion, and identification of problems. And across these measures that they laid out, they found a steady expansion of participatory norms during periods of frequent elections. Now, these reforms of participation are election driven. Campaigns activate local networks, rallies create political publics, repeated electoral movements keep politics socially visible. Sadly, synchronized election proponents misunderstand this ecology, because by reducing the number of electoral movements, you are reducing the number of democratic entry points into political life as well. They show that while voting has become broadly inclusive, active political participation still remains socially skewed. Those who engage beyond voting, like campaigners, party workers, opinion shapers, policy entrepreneurs, they are disproportionately educated, male, upper caste, or a dominant OBC. economically secure. This matters enormously because national elections simply amplify precisely the forms of participation that favors these very groups. This takes place in the form of media driven campaigning, leader centric narratives, resource intensive mobilization. State elections, by contrast, have lower barriers to entry. They depend more on local networks, they center tangible issues, they allow smaller actors to be able to be in a position where they can influence. Synchronization, therefore, does not merely reduce political participation, but it reshapes participation in favor of the already powerful. And you take away the voice of the subaltern in the process as well. Frequent elections have normalized political participation and engagement in India. Now, this paper and I as well argue the fact that frequent elections have normalized political engagement in India. And elections are no longer a rare spectacle, they're a familiar civic ritual that takes place in different parts of the country. And that familiarity reduces the fear, especially amongst first generation voters and marginalized communities. Frequent elections protect democratic infrastructure because they keep the political discussion alive, they keep the local leadership accountable, they keep the civil society mobilized at all points in time, and they keep parties responsive to the questions that the public asks. This infrastructure would be removed and replaced with this periodic mass mobilization, which would be followed by long silences. The first thing that comes to mind is that participation does not deepen, it stratifies. So, what would our country look like if we had a system where meaningful electoral contestation takes place once every 5 years? There's a bunch of things that come to mind. One is that political participation does not deepen but stratifies, because in longer inter-election periods, you're going to have a continuation of domination of organized interests, especially from the elite. You're going to see consolidation of bureaucratic and corporate power grow. You're going to see grassroots mobilization weaken. You're going to see political learning for the general masses to start to stagnate. And state elections, they interrupt this very process because they puncture executive insulation and they provide us moments of recalibration. And these interruptions would vanish once you have synchronized elections in the country. Now, in multiple conversations with my peers who support one nation, one election, they often respond to by saying that turnout in national elections is high and sometimes higher than in state elections. But that misses the point entirely because democracy is not just about how many vote, it is about who sets the agenda, who mobilizes whom, and whose issues are heard at the end of the day, and whose voice persists between the election gaps. Participation beyond voting is the real indicator of democratic depth, and that depth depends on frequency and proximity. What the proponents of one nation, one election call efficiency is actually democratic concentration. And when you start looking at the problem through this lens, you see that one nation, one election is not a neutral scheduling reform, it's a concentration of democratic power. And that's because fewer elections would thereby mean fewer moments of accountability with fewer opportunities for mobilization and fewer chances for political outsiders to enter the political space. And this benefits only those who are already embedded within the power structures themselves. And it disadvantages those who rely on elections as a moment of disruption in politics. And Indian democracy has historically moved forward not through stability but through repeated contestation in the first place. And we are completely misreading Indian democratic trajectories if we look at it from that any other perspective. And that's how I think the proponents of one nation, one election are misreading India's democratic trajectory.